Milk slid from her lashes like melted pearls, pooling at her knees as she whispered, "I'm sorry." The pitcher hovered above her head, one tremble from breaking. Then a voice split the room and the lie of their perfect life in half. "Stop. Before we begin, if this kind of story speaks to your heart, share where you're reading from and on a scale from 1 to 10, how many points you'd give this story. It's always beautiful to see how far a story can travel. Enjoy." Chapter 1. The House That Forgot How to Breathe on that cold evening in Brooklyn Heights. The Reed townhouse looked exactly as it had been designed to look, symmetrical, silent, wealthy. The staircase coiled upward like a ribbon, polished wood floors holding the reflections of paintings in gold frames that never blinked. It was a house that knew how to pose, not how to breathe. Alexander Reed, 40, immaculately dressed, his life measured in contracts and square footage, pushed open the front door with the same distracted grace he used to sign seven-figure deals. An Armani jacket across shoulders that never drooped, a Burberry coat that never wrinkled. He moved with the practiced economy of a man who rarely allowed himself the luxury of doubt. He had buried a wife less than 10 months ago. He had buried, more discreetly, the part of himself that knew how to risk loving anything that could be lost. His wife now was Victoria Hayes, 35, flawless as a photograph, a woman who knew how to turn her cheek just so beneath the chandelier's light. She had a voice that could soften the edges of a knife and a silhouette that could be mistaken for gentleness. She held a different kind of power, more delicate because it was unseen. But that night, something was wrong. The blue couch in the living room was empty. At this hour, Sophia, 7 years old with the same soft brown hair as her mother, usually folded herself onto the cushion like a question the house never answered, arms wrapped around 10-month-old Jacob, listening for the elevator's breath and the key's metallic whisper. Today, the couch stared back at him. Victoria's scream broke the stillness like a dropped glass. Then came Jacob's ragged cry, the sound of a throat chafed by hunger and fear. Alexander took the corridor in long strides. He pushed open the kitchen door, and the world narrowed to the circle of tile where his daughter knelt. Milk fanned across the floor like a chalk outline, the bottle rolling to a slow stop against the baseboard. Sophia, small knees whitening against the tile, hair pasted to her cheeks with milk and tears, curved her body over Jacob in the old stroller that had moved rooms more often than it moved streets. His cheeks were the furious red of a child who knows that mercy has a schedule. Victoria stood opposite, a red dress hugging her like a promise, hair tied into a neat high bun that turned her neck into a column. In her hand, a glass pitcher tilted, drops still falling. Her face wore the fury of someone who believes anger is logic. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered, fingers splayed against Jacob's chest as if she were guarding a small fire in the rain. "I only wanted my brother to have a full stomach." "Stop." The word tore itself from Alexander's throat. It was not the polished tone he used on the phone. It was raw and father enough to startle even him. "Put the pitcher down." Victoria blinked. Fear flashed, then vanished under a smoother expression. She set the glass down with exaggerated care. "I was only teaching her a lesson," she said, voice re-softened. "She took the milk I keep for self-care without asking. We can't let such habits form. She needs boundaries." Alexander's eyes flicked over Sophia, the soaked dress he remembered from Macy's, bought before birthdays became brittle. He felt the gaze of the photographs on the walls and hated the way he felt watched, judged by still images in golden cages. "Sophia," he said, forcing calm over his trembling, "you can't take things without asking. Tell me next time, I'll handle it." The words felt like stones in his mouth. He saw the milk on his daughter's eyelashes and heard Jacob's breath hiccup. And yet, Victoria's fingers on his sleeve, the hum of her soothing voice, the practiced choreography of the moment pulled something heavy over his eyes. "We have to be united," Victoria murmured. "Otherwise, the children will never learn." The house was too clean. Even the refrigerator's hum sounded virtuous. Alexander looked away, looked back, and did nothing else. Didn't ask why the children's bowl was spotless and the adult's bottle full, didn't follow the tremor in Sophia's small shoulders to its source. He nodded, because nodding was easier than admitting he didn't know how to unfreeze. After a long moment, he turned away with a motion he could tell himself was composed. Upstairs, the study weighted with dark wood and a silver laptop that had begun to feel heavier than it looked. He opened the machine, typed a password, and hovered. Then he clicked the one folder he had refused to click for months, Olivia. Her face filled the screen, darker hair than Sophia's, eyes that contained the weather and the calendar. She had filmed the message during a quiet afternoon while he had been out buying a second crib just in case. "Alex," she said gently, like she always did, "if I can't be there, take care of Sophia and Jacob. Don't let the light in her eyes fade. Her eyes will speak for her. And please don't ever blame the boy. It isn't his fault." He pressed the base of his palm to his forehead, feeling the hot ache of withheld tears. Downstairs, Jacob cried, a sound like a thread pulling and pulling, fraying the edges of a father's dignity. In the window's reflection, he saw a man who had mistaken motion for change. He lifted his head, and there she was, Sophia on the back stoop, a plastic bag of leftover bread in her hands, the cold air lifting the hair off her milk-damp forehead. Jacob lay restless in the stroller, trying to capture the air with his small fists. Sophia broke a bit of bread and held it like a secret. He opened the back door. Night air licked the warmth from the kitchen. "Dad, please." Sophia's voice was so gentle he could barely catch it. "He's hungry." He looked at the bread. He looked at his son. He looked at the gleaming fridge behind him with its precise rows of glass. And something, pride or routine or the impulse to defend his choices, gave up its seat and walked off the stage. "Come inside," he said, the softness in his voice surprising him. She pushed the stroller over the threshold with the carefulness of someone who knew how easily thresholds could bite. Alexander pulled a chair for her. He poured warm water and slid it across, his hands unsteady. "You want to tell me anything?" he asked. "No." The word was scarcely sound. Her fingers tightened around the stroller's handle as if she were bracing for an earthquake only she knew was coming. He wanted to say, "I'm sorry." He wanted to say, "I've been blind." But the house had trained him in a different vocabulary, in patience that was really avoidance, in tolerance that was really fear. Footsteps approached. Victoria's perfume arrived a breath before she did, vanilla and money. "What a sweet scene," she said, smiling at a temperature that never changed. "It's late." "Sophia, to bed." Alexander cleared his throat. "Give Jacob some milk first." Victoria bent at the refrigerator with the grace of a ballerina and poured a boy's portion with a miser's hand. Alexander watched the angle of her wrist and felt something hard and awake move inside him. That night, after the lights were out, 2 devices the size of buttons blinked red and then settled into the blue of watching. Noah Patel, the building's calm-eyed tech manager, had come at dawn with a toolbox and no questions. One camera perched high on the kitchen cabinet, the other in a corner of the living room where the light pooled in the evenings. Alexander had felt foolish explaining himself. Then he had thought of milk on eyelashes and had stopped feeling anything but determined. Chapter 2. The quiet war. The days unfolded with a stillness that was more warning than peace. Sophia learned how to fold herself into invisible shapes, how to make hunger look like quiet, how to make pain look like clumsiness. At school, when a classmate's sandwich sat unguarded for one blessed second, her fingers hovered, then retreated. Emily Parker caught her before shame could grow too large. "Drink this," Emily said softly, pressing a milk carton into her small hand. "If you need extras for your baby brother, you ask me." She said it the way one says a password. In Emily's classroom, a bruise lived briefly on Sophia's wrist and then moved, careful as a mouse, under a sleeve. Emily wrote notes. She didn't push because she knew the push could make a child bolt delicate as a deer. But at home that night, she sat at her kitchen table, reopened her laptop, and typed a sentence into an anonymous email address she never used. "If you are still a father, take a closer look at what is happening in your house." She paused before sending it. Teachers were supposed to take the long road to document until the path was paved with proof. But the way Sophia held her brother's picture, the way she breathed when she thought no one was listening, did not belong to the long road. Emily pressed send and prayed she had not ruined and had not already failed. The camera's unblinking gaze captured a choreography that should not have existed. A spoon fell, and Victoria's hand flew as if pulled by a string. A bottle was mixed, milk, water, patience, but then placed just out of Jacob's reach as the boy's tongue searched air for mercy. Victoria held the house like a vice hidden in velvet, squeezing until it left no marks you could show to a judge without bringing your soul to the witness stand. Alexander watched. He watched at night when he had closed the laptop on the deals that still paid for the long windows. He watched his daughter kneel, watched his son's mouth open to the world, watched his wife's anger sharpen into words like boarding school and consequences. He watched, and something in his gaze, something trained on blueprints and valuations, relearned a more necessary focus. He had been a father in absentia, a guardian of accounts and an avoider of pain. But pain does not wait for signatures. It creates its own paperwork. He went to the bank, revoked access on secondary cards that had leaked like punctures in a tire. He called Henry Collins, an old friend of Olivia's and the one lawyer he trusted to point him toward a justice that didn't taste like blood. "Freeze what you can freeze," he told Henry, "and come over tonight. Bring the kind of pen that writes the truth." Meanwhile, Victoria moved forward with the confidence of a plan well rehearsed. A dinner guest arrived in a crisp suit and with a smile that knew which hand to shake and when to release. Richard Coleman, her personal attorney. His eyes had the smoothness of someone who never took a staircase two at a time. "I can simplify your structure," he told Alexander, flipping to pages marked with clips. "For tax efficiency." The words fell like glass chips, harmless at first glance and dangerous if you slid your hand across them. Alexander touched the paper and waited for the moment when patience would no longer be a virtue. He had spent his life trusting the timing of markets, the slow thickening of values over time. He had also spent 10 months mistrusting his heart because it had broken. But he was learning different clocks. That evening the house was staged, napkins folded into lilies, candles burning at a socially acceptable height. Sophia fed Jacob carefully, as if the bowl were fragile dignity. Victoria was honey poured over a blade. "I found a boarding school that can help," she said, eyes bright. "Structure, discipline, she'll thank us later." "Where?" Alexander asked. "How far?" She smiled. "Far enough to undo bad habits, close enough for visits." Her mouth softened. "If she deserves them." On the kitchen camera, the red light remained steady, patient. It knew the end of the act was not the end of the play. Chapter 3, The Notebook. Later that night, Alexander walked into Sophia's room with a reason he didn't bother to invent. He opened a drawer to look for a pencil he could buy 1,000 times over. His fingers found something soft, frayed at the edges, corners taped with care, a little blue notebook. He hesitated, then he opened it. There were dates that marched down the left margin like quiet soldiers. There were sentences like fence slats, short, upright, spaced for breath. "Today my brother cried because he's hungry. Today she made me kneel. Today she said if I tell, Jacob won't get milk." He turned pages he had no right to have missed. A scribble at the bottom of one page said in shaky letters, "Miss Emily said I can take a carton home. Don't let her know." His breath slowed to something so heavy he thought it might bruise his chest from the inside. He was a man who owned buildings, who knew the language of steel and concrete and zoning regulations. But under his own roof, a small girl had drawn up blueprints of survival in ink that wavered with hunger. The door creaked. Victoria leaned against the frame, her smile tilted like a blade that had recently been sharpened. "What are you doing in the girl's room?" He closed the notebook like a tender animal before a storm and slid it into his jacket with a motion casual enough to be mistaken for innocence. "Looking for the school communication sheet," he said. "In the kitchen," she replied. "I left it in the mailbox. You can ask me any time. No need to rummage." She stepped closer and smelled like Chanel and certainty. "We agreed I'd handle the children. Don't let your grief make you soft." He watched her leave. He sat on the edge of the bed he had not warmed with a story in too long. He took the notebook out again and put a palm to it. For perhaps the first time since Olivia's heart failed the day Jacob arrived, he allowed himself to picture the weight of his son's legs on his forearm, the way Sophia's head had once fit precisely into the crook of his neck, while he read aloud about green eggs and hams, about tigers and kings. He allowed himself grief that did not deny responsibility. He stood and went to find his children. He found Sophia in the semi-dark, whispering to Jacob the way she had learned to whisper to keep the air smooth. "Is it true?" he asked, gently placing the notebook on the small table as if he were setting down a truth so it would not run. She looked at it. She looked at him. She looked at Jacob, who whimpered, a tiny bark of hunger. She shook her head, then nodded, then pressed her lips white until finally the dam broke quietly. "I'm not afraid of being hit," she whispered, tears spilling as if someone had cracked the sky with a fist. "I'm afraid my brother will starve. Please don't hate him." Alexander went to the kitchen and mixed a bottle with hands that shook like he was new to gravity. He returned. He watched Jacob's mouth take the rubber and the world begin to settle inside the boy's body. He listened to that small sound, the sound of a child swallowing relief. When Victoria swept back in, she moved fast, like a dancer changing tempo mid-song. She reached for the notebook. He closed his hand over it with a finality that made her blink. "Leave it," he said, his voice the cold of a blade that had been waiting its whole life to be sharpened. She tried again with that old sweetening. "She's jealous. She makes things up to get attention." He slid the notebook into the small cabinet by the crib and locked it. He looked up and met Victoria's eyes with the gaze of a man who knew where he had failed and intended to stop failing. "Tomorrow," he said, "we're going to talk." When she left, he pulled out his phone. "Harris," he whispered when Detective Daniel Harris answered on the second ring. "I need you to watch something you won't want to watch." "Keep recording," Harris said, voice steady. "Don't tip your hand. I'll loop in the DA and be ready when you are." Chapter 4. Everything that breaks makes a sound. The afternoon of the reckoning arrived wearing a polite suit. The living room filled with glass and candlelight. Richard Coleman laid out papers with language that could make a bank lean forward. Victoria stood near as if she were about to be applauded. Sophia kept close to Jacob's stroller and counted the breaths between his sighs as if breath were currency and they had to budget. Alexander emerged from his office holding a remote and a silence that felt like weather. The walls watched, the refrigerator hummed, even the staircase seemed to hold its breath. "I've seen enough," he said, and his voice was not loud, but it was impossible to ignore. "It's time to stop performing." He pressed play. On the wall, the kitchen appeared as if it had taken a step out of its body. There was the angle of Victoria's wrist and the slap that followed a fallen spoon. There was a bottle moved out of reach with the ease of someone who enjoyed the exquisite cruelty of inches. There were words that had never been meant for light. "All of this should be mine," hissed through clenched teeth, "and not some brat's to ruin." Victoria lurched to her feet. "You edited this," she said, disbelief already fraying at the edges. "You trapped me," Richard smiled through grit. "Home videos rarely hold up as full context, Mr. Reed. Legally speaking." The door opened. Detective Harris entered with 2 officers and a warrant that had been folded then unfolded with professional care. "Don't," Victoria said when the officer's hand touched her arm. She jerked free, eyes boiling. "Without me, you're nothing," she spat toward Alexander. Then she looked at Sophia and something unsafe flashed in her face. "You ruined everything." "No," Alexander said quietly, as if correcting a child's mispronunciation. "You did." Richard tried one last attempt at poise. Anthony Blake, a slippery accountant in a dark shirt, reached the threshold just in time to hear his own name attached to the words fraud and embezzlement. He stopped smiling then. Patricia Gomez stood in the hall behind the officers, hands flour-dusted, eyes sharp. She shook her head once, an older woman's verdict enough. "Mr. Reid," Harris said, practical as the morning mail, "the children stay with you. A social worker will conduct a routine check. For now, we'll secure the footage." As Victoria's world, built on appearances and fear and careful illusions, was marched into a cooler air, Jacob cried. Not a scream this time, just a small sound of confusion, a lost boy asking what shape the world would take now. Alexander reached into the stroller with hands that once arranged deals by the millions, and the weight of his son in his arms undid him. He pressed his lips to the soft spot on Jacob's head and said to the child and to the room and to the man in the window reflection who was trying to make himself new, "I'm sorry. I let you suffer too long." Sophia watched the shape of her father's hands around her brother and thought, for the first time in months, that maybe stop could be the beginning of something and not just a hinge between humiliations. When the last uniform disappeared into the elevator's mouth and the quiet returned, she looked up, eyes enormous and damp. "Are you going to leave us again?" she asked. The question arrived like a needle, precise and unavoidable. He knelt. He put a hand on her back lightly, as if a heavier touch would break the instrument she had become. "No," he said, "I'm staying." He had lied to himself many times in the last 10 months. He did not lie now. Chapter 5, the work of staying wasn't a speech. It was dawn and the accidental scald of water as you misjudge a bottle's temperature on a sleepless night. It was learning the weight of a baby's head and how to tilt his chin so the milk didn't dribble down the sides. It was realizing the floor creaked outside the crib and learning which plank to avoid at 2 in the morning. It was an apology that never ended and didn't have to. Sophia didn't immediately crown him with forgiveness. She stood at doorways, arms folded, counting. She slept with one ear open as if the house could turn again in its sleep and roll her into the dark. She watched for the way his hand moved toward Jacob's bottle, whether it wavered, whether it emptied it, or whether he left things in reach without noticing at all. She watched and documented, not on paper this time, but in the little ledger children keep in their hearts, the one adults forget exists because the book is small and the handwriting is slow. He took them to the hospital at 2 in the morning when Jacob's fever leapt like a sudden flare. The nurse's badge read Carla. Dr. Carter spoke with gentle precision, offering instructions like a simple recipe. Sophia pressed herself against the white of Alexander's dress shirt and let herself be a smaller animal for 20 minutes. On the drive home, the city still throbbed with the late lights of people who mistook brightness for joy. The townhouse looked less like a fortress and more like a place that could be taught to forgive itself. The next day, a knock sounded at the door. Emily Parker stood on the threshold with cartons of milk and 2 worn storybooks. "I hope it's okay," she said, a little shaky as if she were the one under evaluation. "I've been watching out for Sophia and Jacob. If you need anything, forms, reports, I'll help." Alexander knew at once where the anonymous email had come from. He did not expose it. He simply nodded and said, "Thank you for seeing her." Patricia arrived with soup, too salty by most standards and exactly right for grief. A woman named Maggie from the diner down the block delivered bread and a hand on the arm that said the city didn't have to be cold. The building super fixed a draft that had existed for years and hadn't mattered to anyone until now. Small stitches, all of them. But it took small stitches to hold a wound closed, nights folded into weeks. The cameras were removed, their work was done. The notebooks changed color from blue to red, from fear to observation. "Dad made good cocoa," one page read. "He burned the first pancakes but didn't give up." Another line, "Jacob laughed when Dad kissed his belly. He has a deep laugh like the ocean in a seashell." On a Sunday, Alexander opened his laptop while Jacob's breath warmed the room and Sophia colored stars around a paper house. He began to type, a title forming slowly like a cautious bloom, Hope Haven. A place where tired hands could rest, a kitchen always warm, a room where a social worker asked questions that did not hurt. He called Henry. "I need articles of incorporation," he said. "Nonprofit, transparent, clean?" "Already drafting," Henry replied, and Alexander could hear Olivia's laugh somewhere between the words. 3 days later, Erin Morales, former social worker, current problem solver, walked into the Reed home with a compact smile and a folder. She read the plan, asking questions that measured courage more than money. "We'll start small," she said, tapping the page. "Kitchen, counseling corner, learning table, volunteers, and rules that make sense." Maggie sent pastries by the box, sending the smell of good mornings into the spaces where bad afternoons used to squat. Patricia brought a crate of children's books that smelled like childhood, she announced briskly. Emily arrived with crayons that rolled loudly in their cardboard case so Joy would not be shy. Erin recruited 2 grad students, Jared and Mia, who knew how to speak with children like they were already people. On paint day, there was a blank wall as tall as a dare. "What do we put here?" Alexander asked Sophia, handing her the brush like a baton. She bit her lip, thought, and made the first stroke. Letters came in careful curves, supported by a father's ladder steady beneath her small sneakers. "Family is where no one is left behind." Erin nodded. "That's the mission statement." Sophia smiled in a way that made Alexander want to thank his own heart for staying alive long enough to see it. News came of Victoria's sentence, 3 years to think her thoughts without an audience, restitution for what could be repaid, and probation to keep her away from small hands. Richard Coleman resigned from his firm before it resigned him. Anthony Blake met the inside of a courtroom that did not accept misunderstanding as a defense. Alexander didn't give interviews. He signed forms and turned cameras away with a palm lifted and a sentence, "We're moving forward." He didn't live for revenge. He lived for Tuesday mornings when Jacob took 3 steps between couch and armchair and then fell, laughing like he had discovered gravity just to make fun of it. He lived for the way Sophia's handwriting steadied, as if her fingers had finally unclenched now that no one was rationing light. Chapter 6. The word after stop, Hope Haven, opened on a Saturday with a crooked sign and the smell of cinnamon. Children drifted in holding adult hands that were more used to clenching than guiding. Alexander moved through the space like a man who was done pretending to be more complex than he was. He poured milk. He wiped a spilled cup with a smile that didn't check the clock. He sat on a beanbag while Mia read about a small bear who got lost and got lost again and learned that found is a practice, not a place. Sophia took charge of the art table. She handed a crayon to a boy who flinched at fingers moving fast. "No rush," she said. "You go when you're ready." He looked up, surprised by a world that could wait for him. At dusk, tiny lights were draped like a net across the backyard. Maggie ladled cocoa. Patricia handed out cookies with a military precision that somehow made children relax. Emily guided a choir of small voices in a low-pressure carol that insisted on nothing but carried everything. "Dad," Jacob said suddenly, the syllable clear as a bell. He stretched his chubby hands toward Alexander as if bartering an entire universe in one word. Alexander swallowed. He lifted the boy and pressed him against his chest. He felt under his palm the small furnace of a life he had almost failed and was now determined to honor. "I hear you," he whispered, and the word carried backward through time, ricocheting off the night he had said stop and finding the little girl kneeling in milk and touching the woman in the video whose eyes had given him his assignment. Erin approached with a sheet of paper full of names and a list of new donors. "Scholarships for school supplies," she said, almost smiling. "A local grocery will set aside a weekly crate of fresh produce, and the city approved the grant for counseling. We'll do it clean," he said. "We'll show every receipt. You always did like straight lines," Henry teased later that week, bringing a frame for the mission statement. "Not always," Alexander admitted, "but I'm learning to follow the right ones." Sophia hung a paper star near the top of the tree. She asked permission with a look he understood now, a look that said, "Are you still here?" He nodded, and she climbed the small step stool with confidence that didn't wobble. Snow dusted the backyard. The city smelled like winter and remembering. The house on the hill had learned to breathe. The radiator's clicks sounded less like a threat and more like a heartbeat. The walls reflected not just light but laughter too. In the bedroom, Olivia's photograph held its patient smile. Alexander tilted it a millimeter to the right and said, low enough to only be heard by the part of the world that listens to whispers, "I kept my promise." Sophia heard anyway, somehow. She slid her small hand into his, a form of applause closer than any crowd could offer. "Dad," she said, trying the word the way one tries a new song. "Can I learn to make cocoa like Mom made it?" He had always been good at formulae. He was new at recipes. "We'll learn together," he said. "Tell me what you remember." "2 spoons," she said, "not too sweet." Jacob giggled like a permission slip. Alexander set a pot on the stove. The milk warmed. The wooden spoon tapped the side of the pan like a gentle metronome. He was not thinking of spreadsheets or timelines or how little he knew about weather. He was thinking of how to hold a spoon so the milk doesn't stick, and how to hold a family so the heat didn't burn and didn't die. Outside, the city glowed tall, unblinking, busy. Inside, a man, a girl, and a boy learned how to remain. The biggest twist of all was not the hidden cameras or the arrest at a dinner party, not the greedy scheme or the courtroom's cool math. It was the simple fact that staying turns out to be louder, kinder, and more disruptive than any departure ever was. People will tell you that the word that changes a life is go, or yes, or love. Sometimes it is simpler. Sometimes the word is stop. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the word that follows is stay. Epilogue, for the road you're on months later, Hope Haven's walls wore murals of handprints and small animals that looked, depending on the angle, like courage. A whiteboard tracked tutoring times and counseling slots. On the last Sunday of the year, Sophia's new red notebook lay open to a fresh page. Today, Jacob walked 6 steps. Dad burned the toast, but we laughed. We are not afraid of the kitchen anymore. Alexander read it and smiled a smile that never would have fit the man who first stood in that kitchen with milk on the floor and a house full of expensive quiet. He looked out at the yard where fresh snow wrote its own story and decided to keep learning. He turned toward the photograph on the mantel. "We have lost too much," he murmured, "but from now on there will be only light. Late light, maybe, but light." Victoria Hayes sat in a cell miles away, rehearsing old justifications to an audience of walls. Alexander did not think of her. Revenge is a second stove that wastes heat. He kept the one in front of him burning. Sophia closed her notebook, looked at her father, and asked a question he could finally receive without flinching. Can we invite Miss Emily and Miss Erin and Miss Maggie and Grandma Patricia for dinner on Friday? We can, he said. We will. Everyone eats. That was the true inheritance, the only kind that matters, not buildings or accounts or press releases, but a table wide enough to seat those who had taught them how to survive and how to stay. A table set with cocoa and soup and bread and, finally, enough milk for every small hand that reached. Thank you for spending time with this story. I'd love to hear from you. What moment hit you the hardest? The milk on Sophia's lashes, the whispered stop, the notebook, or Jacob's first dad? If you were Sophia, how would you send a signal for help, and to whom? You believe one timely word can save a childhood. Share your thoughts, and if this story touched you, consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs a reason to believe in late arriving light. Your comment might be the lifeline someone else is waiting for. And you, are you doing okay today? If you're carrying something heavy, leave a few words here. We'll listen.